Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today's guest is my esteemed colleague, Professor Darrell Hamamoto, writer, academic, and specialist in U.S. media and ethnic studies. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you, Mr. Williamson. It's great to be back with you here. I would like to express my appreciation for you being a guest on my show. So I
Yeah,
am
thank you.
reciprocating.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That was a couple weeks ago. I'll put a link to that below after our discussion here. And just so my people, my audience, as an introduction, Professor, you've written a couple of very good books. This one's called Nervous Laughter: Television Situation Comedy and Liberal Democratic Ideology. This is situation comedies from the Honeymooners to Bill Cosby. I really enjoyed this book. And Servitors of Empire: Studies in the Dark Side of Asian America. You have several other books too.
That's right. And The Conservatives of Empire, which you just showed, the penultimate chapter is on John Lennon and Yoko Ono.
I
And
know.
I claim them for the Asian American political movement. He was on his way to a rally in San Francisco, but he wasn't able to make it because of a fateful moment at the Dakota Residential Hotel, as we all know about, in December of
Yes.
1980.
Yeah, so plenty of things that we can talk about in the future. This topic today, we're going to be talking about Beatles skeptics. And this is a topic that maybe some people aren't that aware of. Many people will know exactly as we get into it, know what we're talking about here. But let me just tell people a little bit about your channel, because your channel on YouTube is called Professor Hamamoto of Cultural Forensics. And can you give us a little bit of background to some of your topics?
Yes, cultural forensics implies the notion that we can understand the political system, the economic structure via culture, right? And not just elite or high culture, which we'll talk about in a moment, where it deals with historiography, but also, importantly for me, the popular culture. Because as you've seen by my partial bibliography, I'm interested in mass media, television, popular music, which is your forte. And from there, I can glean bits of information about the hidden structures, I call it. Some people call it the deep state. I don't usually call it that because there's nothing deep about it. It's hidden in plain sight. And that's part of the historiography of the people that we're going to be looking at today, or the body of work, if you want to call it that, that these individuals are promulgating. You call them skeptics. I think that's as good as a term as any out there right now.
Well, actually, I think I have a better term. I like to call them Beetle flat earthers is my term for them.
Even better.
But Beatles skeptic is the more academic, the more maybe polite way of saying it. But can you give
Mhm.
viewers here a little bit of background on where this Beatles skepticism comes from and what it entails? Because you've kind of alluded to it just now, but it might be something that some of our viewers don't know.
Yeah, it's been much written about, and from my own investigation, I would even call it research. It seems to have a genesis in an Italian couple, not Italian American, overseas in Italy. And someone sent me the article of a translation of it. And it was very weak. And this was the couple that I forgot their name, that first tried to put this together. And then the most significant, if you want to call it that, gloss on the Beatles were a faux for FAUX was a woman whose name I forget. I think I intentionally blocked their names out, who claims to have been an attorney, for what that's worth. And she went through all the different supposed data points that indicate that, well, as an offshoot of this, Paul's dead, but also that the Beatles were a entirely synthetic construct of some sort of intelligence operation. The usual suspects, MI6 being one of them,
Yes,
Tavistock, right? Psychologies. We'll talk about that. So
yes.
that, in a
So
nutshell, is sort of the genesis of this, what's now become a minor industry of Beatleology.
Yeah, the Beatles world, it just makes so much money in so many different facets. And this has become another one, these whole Beatle flat earthers, as I call them. And you talked about the Beatles, they try to put forth the idea that the Beatles were the prefab four created by intelligence. They didn't play any of their instruments, they didn't write any of their songs. And this is something that, as we go through this, is not new. This has been around for some time, and I'd like you to expand upon that a little bit and where it maybe started from, or where there's been some books written about it that are very flimsy. And then we'll talk a little bit about why these things get written about and why people clamp onto them so hard.
Well, this is the subject for another discussion, another time, because his work, we can really probe it deeply. But there's a character from Los Angeles called Dave McGowan, who I'll just cut to the chase. I think he's a synthetic person because I've read all four of his books and they're entirely different from each other stylistically, and the topics are kind of related, but not really. But in more recent times, he's the one to put forth the idea that everything, not just the Beatles, everything that came out of the 60s was fake, was engineered, right? From Lookout Mountain, the hidden film studio up there, up by Laurel Canyon, which, by the way, thought it was pretty weird that he uh, he's dead now, so he can't really rebut me here. But I've heard him on radio interviews, and he admits that he never visited Laurel Canyon, and he lives in Los Angeles. I have, I don't live in the area, but it's kind of like a I'd say, yeah, I'd go so far as to say it's kind of a tourist area. If you're interested in pop music, you'll drive through there, and it's a public road. But he never bothered to do that. So I think he was handed a bunch of snitch jackets, as they're called, to undermine this idea that the 1960s, to a large degree, if not in its totality necessarily, to a large degree was something that was organic, that came from the aspirations, the hopes, the defeats, or even the setbacks that were experienced by the baby boom people such as Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, that cohort. And of course, John Lennon and the Beatles in general was a global phenomenon. It certainly captured the English-speaking world. And one of my main bones of contention here is that I don't think these people, because they're conspiracy theorists in their own right, right? It's kind of like a counter conspiracy theory. And they might be psyops in themselves. I don't know. That's what we're talking about today to expand the discussion. But there's all kinds of these different stories that have become they've moved from legend and they become holy writ, right?
Mhm.
The stories are repeated often enough that it becomes the truth instead of a lie or a fabrication or a misremembering. And I think that's why your work, because this is not the first show you've dealt with the topic, your work on historiography is so important, especially when it doesn't even have to deal with the Beatles. It could be about anything, any aspect of history itself.
Mhm.
Um, and why the Beatles? Not only were they so phenomenal so far as the music is concerned, but on a sociological level, anthropological, all the different indices of what constitutes cultural forensics. They're a phenomenon that cannot and will not, on my watch at least, will not be reduced mechanically to just these puppets of some hidden hand, whatever it might be, or some entity like Tavistock.
Mhm.
Because as you stated before, and you can speak to this later in our conversation here, um, corporations don't have soul. We do.
Right.
We're blessed with a soul, and that's creativity, and it's irrepressible. They can try, and I'm not saying that these entities have not tried to guide and steer the popular culture, just like they've done with Taylor Swift and their Swifties, right? Um, I'm
Mhm.
not saying, and I think that was one of the struggles that John Lennon endured and some of the other Beatles, but primarily Lennon because of his political voice, the strength of it.
Well, I share you're feeling that to the Beatle on my watch, they will not be desecrated in this way and reduced to a government psyop. Now, the things that I've been hearing since I started this channel, I get bombarded with what I call the Beatle flat earthers. And anytime they dare to step into my turf, I type on, I said, Beetle flat earther alert. Now, some of their, what they claim has to do with the British Tavistock Institute and a guy named Theodore Adorno, who was supposedly wrote all the Beatles songs and all these other hits of the 60s, which is very silly. But where does that come from? What was the genesis of those particular entities that get brought into this fantasy?
Okay, this is an insight I think that is unique to me. And I, like yourself, had always been intrigued by the invocation of these intellectual giants of the so-called Frankfurt School. It's called critical theory. And by the way, critical race theory, so-called, was a adaptation or perversion of critical theory.
Hmm.
These were expatriate intellectuals from Frankfurt, Germany. Some were from Berlin, but most of them were associated with the University of Frankfurt, and they left Nazi Germany. It was, as the Weimar Republic kind of crumbled,
Mhm.
and the Third Reich came into being. A lot of them migrated to the U.S. or to Britain. So, Freud himself from Austria left to Vienna and
Mhm.
set up shop in London. That's another story, and that's related. And that's maybe where the Tavistock connection starts to coalesce, because Tavistock dealt with psychology, mass psychology. It was formed, I believe, in the wake of World War II when you had massive, what was then called shell shock of all these returning civilians. How are they going to reintegrate them into British society? And then from there on, they realized, hey, we could use this knowledge that we're gaining from these experimental test subjects known as veterans, and we can commemorate them with a little poppy on our national holiday, but we can use this to enslave the rest of the world. And that part is true. See, this idea that it comes out of Tavistock is written on half truths. It's a real entity. It's still in London. They do industrial psychology, organizational psychology. All the large corporations, businesses, universities subscribe to their services that are, and some of them publish, in the Tavistock
Mhm.
publishers, the subsidiaries, and it's probably linked. There's a good chance it's linked to MI6, right? Just like the whole psychology establishment, the psychiatry. So all that is is indeed correct. But then they make the flat earthers, as you call them, the Beatles flat earthers, make this leap into saying that, well, therefore, everything that the Beatles did was fake and controlled by Tavistock. Now, so far as Theodore Adorno is concerned specifically, is that from what I've read of him, he wanted to be known as a musician, as a composer, right, in the elite Western tradition of Beethoven and Brahms and all those people that are revered. And he only secondarily wanted to be known as a social theorist. But in the 60s and the 70s, Adorno, along with people like Herbert Marcuse, these names might not mean anything to anybody, but there was a school of thought that their ideas were integrated into a lot of radical socialist, Marxist, like I said, BLM, Antifa, so-called critical race theory steals from their work and claim it to be their own. So his name resurfaced again after a period of relative obscurity. And he did emigrate to the US. And I think he lived on what was known affectionately back then as Weimar on the Sea, or Weimar on the Pacific. And these were the people who left Nazi Germany and went to work in the Hollywood film industry on the Pacific. They lived in Pacific Palisades or Beverly Hills. They were very well placed because these people were upper class. Most of them were bourgeois, professionals, psychiatrists, psychology writers that come from prominent families. Um, Fred Zinnemann, the director who
Mhm.
did these quintessential American movies like High Noon, he was Austrian. He had a law degree. And
Mhm.
as a child, by the way, I visited his house with my father, who told me his whole backstory, because I lived in this area. So his name Adorno came about, I think, because he was the music consultant to none other than Nobel Prize laureate Thomas Mann,
Mhm.
right? Dr. Faustus, which
Mhm.
was sort of a reworking of a tale that we know through Christopher Marlowe and then Goethe. And then he sold his soul for his art, for his music. But Thomas Mann was a little bit weak on the classical tradition. Um, Adorno wanted to be known as a composer, and he had a very fine grasp of the Western art music tradition and consulted with Mann on that. And I think that's where this misperception started to rise that, oh, okay, he worked with Thomas Mann, so therefore, and he did have some Tavistock connections, therefore, he wrote all the Beatles' music.
I mean, such a stretch. I mean, what you've been describing here, these are dots that are not even connectable, and the stretch and the lengths these people go to suggest that the Beatles didn't create anything is absolutely preposterous. And I just
Mhm.
want to make a kind of a overall arching observation of people who buy into conspiracies or just people who follow conspiracies or don't follow them. I really find most people fall into four categories. So you've got people that believe every conspiracy that comes to them, that they basically feel that they're always getting screwed and that something is against them. And I'm sure
Mhm.
people out there watching this know somebody like that. They'll believe any conspiracy. Then there's a second group, which maybe say, well, I guess if I've got the evidence that say that this thing isn't really how it is, well, let me look at it and I'll base my decision on what evidence there is. So people that are open to it, but judge it based on evidence. Then you have the third group that do not want anything to do with conspiracies. I don't believe any of that stuff. It's not for me. I like my world the way it is. Please don't disturb it. And then finally, we have the fourth group of people that would be in a part of the conspiracy. So everybody falls into one of these conspiracies. And I think that first one is like a personality type, and
Yeah.
people get taken advantage of. And we see a lot of this stuff. There are channels and podcasts about conspiracies. And I like what you said. Where the Beatles are concerned, they get pulled into this as clickbait because the Beatles, from a pop culture standpoint, are so famous. They get brought into this whole conspiracy realm that's a part of a bigger discussion that people get sucked into.
Absolutely. Now, what I like about your fourfold model is that it does admit that conspiracies do exist, but not everything is conspiratorial. Let's take an example where, since we're talking about the Beatles, you may not agree, but from what I'm reading, and I'm looking at a really good book now, and I'm going to, by the way, let me see if I can find it here to show it up on the screen for your audience. It's a new book on the assassination of John Lennon.
Oh,
And
a
I'm
new
more
book.
convinced than
Wow.
ever that he was the victim of a conspiracy.
Hmm.
Now, who the perpetrators were, we can speculate. I have some pretty good ideas. Um, so there are conspiracies, and that's one of my main beefs with the flat earthers is that they don't take it far enough, and they look at conspiracy on the most superficial, naive, fanboy level, right? And I think that's the people who support them, and they might be supported by external agencies, hope that that's where most of the public will leave it. Right. They'll read the Jeffrey Epstein list, the client list. Oh, those are bad people. That's bad. But they won't go beyond the list and find out the real structure, the system of human trafficking, exploitation, and perversion that serves as the glue of our ruling establishment.
Hmm.
You see, so the way we are approaching it has applications on any number of very equally important and crucial aspects of our society, right? Including the use of popular, because that was figured out 20, 30 years ago, probably thanks to the Beatles and the whole 60s pop explosion, which you cover so well. They figured, hey, we can weaponize this. We can steer it for our purposes. And that's conspiracy,
Hmm.
right? That fits the definition of conspiracy. So I'm not saying that conspiracies don't exist. I'm just saying in the case of the clickbait flat Earth people, is that they have the best a partial understanding of what really shapes our world and the degree of engineering that's involved in it. And it's palatable. It's easy. You can just read it and probably it's the same with you. I always get these comments. We're going to get comments in our talk here saying, oh, yes, John Lennon, Tavistock. It's just a knee-jerk response. And I would just ignore it, except for the fact that I think there's something more devious underlying these trolls. And that is to really divert people from thinking more deeply structurally, or I call it cultural forensics, about anything in our
Mhm.
world. Basic propaganda. It's what
Mhm.
Tavistock itself figured out so well and is still using us. They're deploying these mind, and the British are experts at it. And their American cousins, the OSS, they worked very closely. World War II was sort of the catalyst where all this started unfolding. So I can kind of understand where the Beatles flat earthers are drawing their information from, but it's incomplete. And just because you have these hypotheses doesn't mean necessarily it's going to result in the type of flat earth theory that they are bandying about.
Well, that's why I feel that it speaks to a personality trait of people that always feel they're getting screwed, like nothing is real. I can't explain it, therefore it must be a construct. And that's where we find the Beatles here, or this idea where
Mhm.
they didn't write any of their own music or play any of their own instruments. And the people that perpetrate this fantasy, they have to, in order to do that, you have to ignore mounds and mounds of information
Mhm.
and documentation that refute
Yeah.
that. And so then what we've seen then with the Beatles, even more popular than the Beatles didn't write their own music or play on their own songs, is the even more popular fantasy aimed at the lowbrow chumps, and that is the Paul is dead conspiracy, or as I call them, the PID freaks. And the term
Yes.
freaks is used, that's from the John Lennon term,
Is that how do you sleep?
how do you sleep? Yeah, where he says
Yeah.
those freaks was right when they said you was dead. The PID freaks are the ones this is the lowest brow of this type of conspiracy. And the idea that Paul McCartney was replaced by a double and all this stuff, even after computer voice verification has proved this wrong, they don't want to
Mhm.
know about that. They don't
Yeah.
care about the documentation. And one of the things I wanted to talk to you about this, Professor, was the fact that Peter Jackson's Get Back documentary really laid this idea of Paul is dead to waste because it was there was so much evidence there and they talked so much about their early days and it couldn't possibly be fabricated. And
No.
why would you do that? It doesn't make any sense. So, I mean, it really, again, this comes to, and I'm calling out some of these Beetle flat earthers that they come with no um, honesty to the discussion at all, other than just
Mhm.
to push forward these fantasies that I think it says more about them than it does the topic.
Mhm. Now, Matt, I agree with you all the way down the line. However, I don't think they're a category unto themselves of lowbrow, moronic individuals, although they are moronic. I think it's a characteristic of the general population. So I think it's much more pervasive. And that's why I'm engaging this topic because it's not, if they were just morons, that's okay. Right? They can play with their Rubik's Cube or Sudoku. I mean, you got to be brilliant to do that. You also have to be
Mhm.
autistic. You got to shut out everything in your world to be a Rubik's Cube champion. But unfortunately, the world thrives on people who can sit behind video games and drop drones on Hamas,
Mhm.
from 10,000 miles away in the Nevada desert, right? We have to look at the totality here.
Yeah,
And that's why this discussion is important.
yeah, and this is the co-opting something so simple. Not that the Beatles are simple, but there's a straightforwardness to the Beatles, and we'll talk about their art in a moment. But there have been over a dozen or so books on the Paul is dead phenomenon, and so there's a lot of money in this. And
Mhm.
again, this is this feeds this whole propagandist society that we live in. And it's funny, the Beatles, I think, are one of the easiest ones to see through. And you mentioned a
Hmm.
couple of the other ones, not as easy to see through. There's a little more backing and a little more money behind those things.
Hmm.
Well, this Paul is dead thing, I mean, this is just a little minor thing, I think, that has just run off on its own just because there's money to be made there. And,
Hmm.
it fuels many podcasters and it fills the space for people that gravitate toward conspiracy. So I just find it funny that, and people have said to me, I've not mentioned this much on my channel, but I have some followers that said, "Hey, Matt, why would you give any credence to this idea at all?" And I said,
Hmm.
"Well, because it keeps rearing its ugly head in my comment section. And I
Yeah.
wanted to take this opportunity to, at least in terms of the Beatles conspiracies and
Hmm.
these theories, these seem to be dying. And I
Yeah.
think that there's much better writing being done now that relies on not just very solid evidence, but documentation. And the Peter Jackson film I just mentioned, these things are starting to add up in ways that really destroy and lay to waste these Beatle conspiracies. Would you agree?
Absolutely. As you're speaking, I'm holding up this book called
Oh,
Tune
yeah.
In. Talk about documentation, talk about historiographic veracity. I mean, he's trying. Not everybody's going to get everything right, but he's moving in that direction. We're talking about Lewis on here.
Mark
The other
Lewison.
characters are not even in the game. They're not even on that playing field. And that's why I'm involved with this discussion here. The problem is the general public lacks the type of discernment to distinguish between the amateur wankers who put this PID stuff out, or the Beatles flat earthers, versus people who are serious about historical, cultural knowledge and information. And the numbers of people such as yourself and others is growing, it's multiplying. So your thesis that these people are falling by the wayside is true. But you know what? They keep coming back, right? Just like
They sure do.
every 20 years or so, there's a new book on, well, Jesus didn't exist, right? We're
Mm,
talking about the Beatles. One of the favorite books, and I think I read in the one of these histories of the Beatles, one of the favorite books of the time before John Lennon put his foot in his mouth. Right? He was reading the Passover plot,
yes.
and I was alive. I was reading it too. And it was this whole idea that, and we're seeing it now. There's a book now called, well, I won't mention the name, but there's a new character who is promoting the fact that it's a concoction, it's a fiction. That Jesus of Nazareth is something that was created by the Caesars in order to subjugate this population of rebellious slaves, right?
Hmm. Yeah, this seems to
But we see
be,
that time and time. There's a whole, and I think you're right about the psych. There is a psychology that defaults to that all the time. We're also seeing something similar or parallel to this flat Earth PID stuff with the resurgence in, disclosure of a government, UFO or UAWs, whatever they're calling them now.
right. Yeah.
And we're seeing academic literature, and then that is also something that's been recycling periodically since the end of the of World War II. It's a Cold War phenomenon,
Mm.
and it parallels the Beatles. So maybe there's something that the ufologists have in common with the Beatle flat earthers. A
Well, we
similar psychology.
Yeah, and like you said, this stuff is so cyclical. We see this Paul is dead thing really took hold during the Lennon Remembers narrative, where Paul McCartney and his work was being undermined for many and through
Yes.
the 80s through Philip Norman's work Shout, which
Mhm.
really hammered McCartney. And every page he was like demeaned. And this was an attempt to undermine McCartney's work. Now, you mentioned, there you go. You also just mentioned Mark Lewison, his work Tune In. His volume two is due out soon. He's he's running behind, but we I'm already starting to see a discrediting of Lewison's work, and this is because, and we know the guy. Every writer has, I guess, some bias. He has some kind of background that he tries not to show in his work. But
Mhm.
there is this cycle of defaming is happening to Lewison now, that he has a
Mhm.
bias against Paul McCartney. So that's starting
Hmm.
to make the rounds amongst podcasters, and I find it very interesting. And this he's only done one volume of a three-volume work. So
Mhm.
there's a lot of speculation and a lot of saying of this and suggesting that this will be pervasive in books that are not even published yet. So
Mhm.
that is a propaganda of another kind, but like it's being applied to even stuff that's we're trying to consume now and that's not even out.
Yeah. Well, I read his book prior to the biographies. He was more involved with detailing the sessions, right? The personnel, the engineers, the people who did the nuts and bolts of the recording, and that really helped advance my knowledge that hey, the Beatles were four individuals, but there was a whole huge group of very creative, innovative engineers and producers. You know, George Martin is just one of he's perhaps the most important of them all, but Jeff Emmerich and all. But that's how I gained a familiarity with Lewison. And I'm in reading this book, and I haven't completed it. It's I don't know how many hundreds of pages long. It's okay. The biases are okay. That's part of the historiographic allowance that's made for people who do this kind of work, and that's why the subject and the practice of history is inexhaustible because we need multiple perspectives, right? Lewison's going to be speaking from his perspective, and new historians, right, who weren't even alive when the Beatles were in their heyday, are going to come along 100 years from now and adding some more information, perhaps from documents that are going to be released by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I don't think the John Lennon story is over yet. The
Yeah.
recent documentary about May Pang, and it
Hmm.
was a good film, and I really appreciate your interview with May Pang recently. Doesn't talk about the John Lennon assassination.
Does not
That
know.
is a glaring omission in Beatles historiography, with the exception of Fenton Bresler, who is a barrister by training and a popular journalist in London,
Hmm.
who's dead now, unfortunately, but wrote the book Who Killed John Lennon. Most people who publish in this area, I look in the bibliography, and Bresler is never mentioned. He's never alluded to. I don't even think that Lewison talks about the Bresler work, Fenton Bresler.
Yeah, I don't think so. I know that Lewison's work is he's pretty much only going up to he may go up to 1974 with a fourth volume if he because
Okay.
that's the when the Beatles officially broke up on paper. So I don't
Hmm.
know how much he goes into the Beatles and the solo Beatles past that. That's I think outside of his area of expertise actually.
Yeah, well, the timeline shift, he doesn't go in strict chronological order, but in reading this book, everybody knows where it's leading to. It's leading to that fateful day in December
Mhm.
1980, where John Lennon was eliminated as enemy of the state. Which
Yeah,
state? And
that's
there have been books written about that.
yes, for sure.
Come Together is one of them by Professor John Wiener of UC Irvine, but he never looks at it. His he's a Marxist, so he can only look it through a certain lens. Like I say, everybody has their distorted historiographic lens they're looking through, and he's also a new leftist, so he's going to try to claim John Lennon from the new left. John Lennon and the Beatles in general were put upon by any number of people who wanted to claim them for themselves,
Hmm.
whatever political cause, right? But if you go, cheering on Chairman Mao, you ain't going to get anywhere anyhow, right? That's John Lennon was saying, just back off me. All you Black Panthers, all you Maoists out there, all you Abby Hoffmans, all you ideological parasites who want to recruit me. And then his solo album, he doesn't believe in Zimmerman. He doesn't believe in blah blah. The whole list. He's been through it. He's seen it,
Yeah.
right? So he's talking about what we're discussing right now. He had to be eliminated. He doesn't believe in the government, that's for sure. When he was well and alive, and when he was an irreverent younger Beatle, he was making these provocative statements. All of them were. Even Paul McCartney I think in his heart of heart is a political radical. He's just more judicious in what he's saying publicly, because we know, thanks to historians, that it was really Paul, since we're talking about his reputation here in retrospect, Paul was the most exploratory of all the Beatles so far as the music is concerned.
Mhm.
I was always assumed, well, since John is so footloose and fancy free and he's always tripping and day tripping and all that, that he was the music. No, he just liked to play rock and roll.
Yeah.
I mean,
Mm.
that was it was passion, which I'm not knocking it, but that Paul really stretched out the boundaries. And I think that for the first time in book form, at least, that expanded understanding of Paul McCartney came out with the book. What's the title?
Many years from now by Barry Miles, I believe.
Barry Miles. And he is a good author because he was one of the,
Yeah.
not because, but he just, to give you a bit of his resume, he was one of the co-founders of Indica, the bookstore,
Mm-hmm.
where all these literary types, some new left. I think it was a leftist. If you're British and you're rock and roll at that time, you're going to be on the left. Unlike today, you're going to be on the right, masquerading as a leftist, right? As Antifa. So he was there, and he's also written about Pink Floyd. He has a very good historian's. I don't think he has a degree in history as such, but he has a really good both experiential and writerly understanding of that whole milieu. So
Mm-hmm. Well, we've got
Barry
some,
Miles. I tip my hat off to him. His
yeah,
work needs to be gone through by any future Beatleologist, and I guarantee you, any PID person or Beatle flat earther will go, Barry who? They
yeah,
don't read that stuff. I read their material. I've read Billy Shears. I read all that stuff. Okay, and it's weak.
very
It's
much so.
weaker than really poor tea. This is full strength Earl Grey.
Well, we are touching on a lot of future topics we can go into that's, falls under that conspiracy umbrella. You had
Mhm.
mentioned, the assassination of John Lennon, and we just had a book in 2022 that was pulled back, and that was The Prisoner of Love by Peter Doggett, which was going to give what I believed was to be a much more deep look at the 5 years in the Dakota where he was idle before the Double Fantasy album and just before he
Mhm.
was shot. And this was halted by the John Lennon estate. So here
Yes.
we have an time where people are looking for more information on John Lennon. He's a fascinating character, and we have a
Mhm.
very well-regarded writer who has a great reputation putting together a book and it stopped at the 11th hour. And I think the Lennon estate basically paid the publisher not to publish it.
Mhm.
And so this is a form of censorship, I believe. And people say, well,
Yeah.
it's nobody's business. Well, yeah, yes, it is, because when you are John Lennon and Yoko Ono, particularly,
Mhm.
or the Beatles or any other pop culture phenomenon, that's
Mhm.
part of the price of fame.
Yeah.
And Lennon and Ono, in the waning days of his life, when they were pushing double fantasy, that's the John and Yoko in love again. That whole story that I believe was concocted by them as
Yeah.
kind of just a PR thing. That was not how they really were.
Mhm.
And it'd be interesting to know what was really going on behind the scenes. And we've got little bits and pieces of it, but it looked like this book was going to give us a lot more, and then it was yanked
Yeah.
out from under us.
Mhm. Well, we know many instances where, because what we're talking about, if you're a celebrity, a public figure, you're fair game, both in Anglo-Saxon common law in Britain, which has really strong slander and libel laws, and in America,
Mhm.
it's been proven, it's been adjudicated in the courts. So we have that. But that does not prevent people from saying, here's $800,000, lose the manuscript. Right? We know this happens. This happens. Sometimes the authors aren't even complicit. There was and I have copies of it because I know it's going to be collectible. It's called Favorite Son, right? Named after the Creedence Clearwater, but
Hmm.
it was slated to be a bestseller, and it was by St. Martin's, which is a trade publisher in New York. They recalled all the copies of Favorite Son. It was about George Bush, the Bush
Oh.
family, and they pulped it, right?
Hmm.
They pulped it. And you can still find copies of it on Amazon. And I think some books, such as the aforementioned Who Killed John Lennon, I think a lot of those were bought up too.
Mm.
If anybody wants to do a public service so far as Beatleology is concerned, they will reprint Who Killed John Lennon, maybe with an updated essay explanatory. I'll be glad to do that. But the full text of Fenton Bressler needs to be back in print because I think that is the most important omission in Beatles historiography. You have a copy, don't you?
I do, and it's right here. So this
Oh,
is a copy
good.
I just picked
Oh,
up on your recommendation, Professor.
great. And
And
you have a hardback copy too.
yeah, this I got on eBay. I found it just end of last year. So it's available out there, but one of those that insofar I've started reading it, it's very good. And
Mhm.
it just gives you, it shows you that there's so much out there that has been written that just don't get talked about.
Right. And that's part of the lint trap function of the PID flat earther people. You know, the lint trap in your dryer.
Hmm.
It's there to kind of capture all the garbage there, and you're focused on cleaning the lint trap, and all the real work that's being done goes ignored because you do have to think and you have to do your own work. For example, Bressler talks about mind control, MK Ultra,
Hmm.
CIA. Those
Hmm.
are core chapters in that book. And this more recent one on the murder of John Lennon takes off from that, right? So because history's the writing of history is cumulative, and I'm glad to see that happening
Hmm.
right now. And I'm going to do I think I've already said this, but I'll repeat myself. I'm going to review the book this coming Sunday on my show
Oh, okay.
because I
Oh,
think
very
it's so
good.
important,
Very
not
good.
just because it's about the Beatles, but it's about the psyops that's done to the world population in general
Yeah.
on pop music, on our food,
Yeah.
on transportation, on the 15-minute cities, on civil matters and uncivil matters,
Hmm.
right? And I'm talking about criminality as well as the everyday dispensing of justice, right? Why don't we deal with that on with the same fervor as these flat earthers? So the flat earthers, the Paul is dead people, the Swifties, Taylor Swift fans, and the people who watch the Golden Globes or the Golden Globalists, as one of my friends calls it, that's eye candy for them, right?
Yeah.
And that's what you were and I are dealing with, Matt. It's called Pop Goes the 60s, but that's why I like your show. I think it's the best one out there. It goes much deeper than the superficial, right? We know about the pop 60s, but man, there's so much that needs to be dug into. Look at your interview with Felix Cavaliere.
Hmm.
Excellent.
Oh,
I mean,
thank
he
you.
was talking, people got to be free. He was writing it, but that's pop music. These are like top hits. Everybody's grooving to it. Grooving is another one of his songs. He
Mhm.
captured the zeitgeist.
Yeah, and
Right.
the
This
thing
guy
that I
he's important. He's an important figure. Felix Cavaliere. And he can still sing. I look at YouTubes of him with his Korg keyboard playing organ, piano, whatever. He's great.
yeah,
That's our pop goes
eh,
the 60s.
and as we do dig deeper, well, the thing that I've noticed and what makes these conspiracies so ridiculous to me is that they are negating art. They're suggesting that the Beatles music could be constructed by government, and this is completely impossible because in order to create art, in this case music with the Beatles,
Mhm.
I mean, you have to have a soul. And
Yes.
these government agencies and the globals, they do not have souls. I'm
Mhm.
convinced of it. So this negation of art, I object to this. That all, and there's been the past 20, 30 years, there's been a real decline in art, as we can see in our pop
Mhm.
culture, and an acceptance of what it would be very low art, I guess we would call it.
Yeah.
And everything from, Piss Christ forward, there's very little art being created, or what they're trying to call art is just something like Taylor Swift and
Mhm.
just the laptop music that we hear today that's not from the soul, that's from an
No.
algorithm, that's from software. So that's where I'm going with
Yeah.
all this Beatles stuff, that the soul and the art of it all is being trampled upon by these crazy conspiracy theorists who preposterously think that this can be created by a government.
Yeah, and why aren't they paying attention to to those characters there? They should focus on Taylor Swift. They'd have a huge audience. She's ultimate clickbait. Has millions of followers on all the social media. But
Yeah,
no,
it
they
took
have to focus on the Beatles.
Yeah, I don't know why that is. That's a good question. I think at some point Taylor Swift will be part of that whole thing. But yeah, I don't know why the Beatles are still popular, and
Mhm.
at least so long as we got war babies and baby boomers, the
Mhm.
Beatles are going to still be the topic of many
Well,
discussions.
I'm glad you mentioned the boomers, Matt, because I wanted to ask you, is there some sort of element of generational warfare going on here? I mean, are the people who are part of the flat Earth group, are they younger ones who didn't grow up with the Beatles and they're tired of hearing this, Beatles that? We want to talk about Swedish death metal. Get off
Yeah,
the historical stage. You ruin the world, like Greta Thunberg. How dare you ruin our climate? So do you
exactly.
see that kind of tension there? Like,
Well,
seriously, kill
I
the old
see.
people.
I'm not quite sure. There seems to be two different groups here. There has been what I get from younger people. I'd like to do a video on this in the future. Is that there's been a backlash against the Beatles. I think because they're just tired of hearing the Beatles, and there's
Hmm.
a natural backlash. And this is people in their 20s. So this is not
Oh,
the hipsters. This is not. So that is going on. There's groups of people that are young that are discovering the Beatles for the first time. I think that's a
yeah.
small niche. Um, I think that the generations, I'm not sure. The flat earthers seem to be older. They seem to
Oh, okay.
have grown up through the 60s and 70s, are disillusioned by it, and they like to, it's a knee-jerk reaction. It's all fake. And I typically just disregard those comments in my comment section. But
Hmm.
there's still a very high number of them, and I see it on other channels as well. And I'm not quite sure if it's a generational war. I'm not quite sure what to make of that. Although I get called a boomer, I'm not a boomer. And
Yeah.
people, knee-jerk reaction to some of my videos when I talk about this type of laptop music that's being created in the mainstream.
Mhm.
Not all new music is like this, but mainstream music certainly is. People say, "Hey, you just get off my grass. You're just an angry old man. You boomer."
Yeah.
That's their reaction. So, and they don't really listen to what I say. So, well, no, there's some very good new music being made. You're just not going to
Hmm.
find it in the mainstream. You got to work very hard to find it. Whereas in our day, 60s, 70s, 80s, early 90s, all you had to do was turn the radio dial to find something very good that was different. That's what's changed.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I confess I do have some of those AI drum loop programs that you can buy. You can build songs around them.
Hmm.
And here's a good conspiracy theory. I think so-called loop-based or sample-based music, as they call it in the marketing, and loop-based music, I think that's a conspiracy that came out of Japan, because hip hop and rap and all that stuff would not be possible without Japanese technology. And those are the people who produced all that stuff. So I hold them responsible for creating all this inane music with the four on the floor bass drum, boom, 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 and all the algorithms. And you hear the AI and auto tune. That's not a Japanese company, but this is like the Taylor Swift. It's
Hmm.
the Avatar sort of, because there was a singer called Hatsue Miku, I think it's called, that the Korg company said we're going to synthesize the human voice, and they've been working on that religiously. Why don't the PID and the Flat Earth people look into that? Those technologies. Why don't they look into Korg, into Yamaha, and to Akai and all those people who made all the DJ machines? It's supposed to be a black art. No, it's not a black African American art. It's a Japanese art,
Hmm.
right? Using the black minstrelsy to get across this oppressive message, unrelenting, four on the floor techno beats. We can get it going on the Germans too with Kraftwerk.
Oh, Kraftwerk. Yeah. I mean, it's very programmatic sounding and trance-like. And yeah, I've experienced that pulling up to a car at a stoplight where the music is so loud. Sometimes I'll listen and say, what is this I hear? And I find it to be very trance-like and very um, programmatic, I guess is the word.
Yeah, very Tavistockian.
There
Yeah,
you go.
why aren't the PID people going in on that?
That's a good
No, it's got to be
question.
the Beatles.
Yeah, because I think it may you may be right. It may be an attack on the older generations, and I just the way I see it, it's just an attack on art because
Hmm.
very few this the newer music that's being made is not called art. There was a
Hmm.
time, and the Beatles are very responsible for this, when popular music was finally viewed as art because of their
Yeah,
work, namely the Sgt. Pepper era.
yeah,
And you never hear that description applied to today's music at all. So what's happened?
no.
It's a removal of art.
Yeah. Well, I admit, not only do I have the drum loop programs, automated ones, you just can kind of program a general rhythm and it comes up with these variations. It even will do like a semi-human feel, so-called,
Hmm.
right? But I
Yeah.
also have Pro Tools. I had two or three versions of Pro Tools,
Mm.
which put everything on a grid, right?
Yeah.
When the Beatles were recording, it's all analog, it was tape,
Yeah.
right? It went
Yeah.
thing with solid state to some extent, but they had to get the musicianship together before they committed to the storage medium, the tape, right? And that's
Hmm.
another reason why Paul is not dead, because we saw in the Peter Jackson movie he's playing his Hofner bass, and he's making up "Get Back" while we watch,
Exactly.
right? He's trying out different lyrics.
That's a very good example of and the PID freaks, they've been pretty silent since the Peter Jackson thing came out because they got nowhere to go. Because how can you
Yeah.
how can, unless Paul McCartney, the fake Paul McCartney's got a chip in his brain back in '69 and he's being sent information to create Get Back on the spot as the Beatles kind of fall in. It's just preposterous. And it
Well, I can
really,
predict what the PID people are going to say. They say, yeah, Peter Jackson, he made the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and
yeah.
that's all AI. That's all the whole movie, Get Back, is a fabrication.
Yeah, I
Right? It's
guess
like,
that's
what?
what they'll say. Yeah, you're right about that. So
Yeah.
they got an answer for everything, but they can never explain the art.
No.
They can't do it. They don't
Right.
have the capacity to even realize that they're canceling art.
Hmm.
That's what I find um, so lowbrow about their approach.
Well, one of the figures who's positioned himself or who has had someone position him as one of the key proponents of the Beatles as Tavistock creation is he's supposed to be a musician himself. So I've listened to his work because I like to check the whole realm out, right? And it's pretty mediocre. It's pretty derivative. Ironically, it's derivative of 60s music, and
Mm-hmm.
it's pretty amateurish. I don't want to mention his name because I would not put anything out like that. Being a professional musician is a serious craft, is a serious art, and everybody thinks he can do it, right? Until you have to do it and to produce it.
Hmm.
And so I think and I'm saying this because I think there's a certain amount of frustration or resentment that some of the wannabes have who think, well, I want to hold your hand. And how tough can that be? But if you've studied the music, if you've tried to play it, if you've got the Beatles complete songbook here with all the keys and the chord progressions, or the Beatles fake book,
Hmm.
and you've looked at it, or the Beatles real book, which is kind of like the jazz fake books with all the transcriptions, and you'll see, wow, they couldn't read a note of music, but you don't have to. You've got the soul, you got the spirit. And you're
Hmm.
right. You've mentioned that multiple times here, and I hope the viewership comes away with that major lesson. AI will not defeat us. The avatars they put out will not defeat us. The talking heads, the World Economic Forum, the Klaus Schwab that says we must eat the bugs, right? You're not going to win because we got soul.
We got soul. And
Yes,
yeah, I
indeed.
agree.
It's everywhere. It's
It is.
irrepressible.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop with solo.
No, I don't want to stop. No, go ahead.
Well, we'll have you back. We've got other topics we can go into that are not very pleasant topics for all Beatle fans to approach. And this is an attempt to make it a little more approachable and to make a little bit of sense out of it,
Right.
because these are, though I see this stuff on the wane, it's not going to go away. And
No.
Professor Darrell Hamamoto, as long as you're around here, you're going to help bring some sense to these conspiracies that are being floated out there.
Gosh, I hope so. And I encourage your listeners to subscribe to your channel, support you on Patreon and the other platforms that you might be monetizing your work with, because it's certainly a voice that we need in these crazy times, right?
Well,
So I
thank you.
support your endeavor and wish you well.
Well, thank you. I want my channel to continue to promote the art of the 60s and support those artists by telling as much truth as we can and getting as close to the truth as we can with good, solid research and documentation
Mhm.
and strong opinions that are backed up. So that's one of the
Absolutely.
things I'm trying to do, and things seem to be working. So I'm very, very pleased that it's going well, and pleased to have guests like yourself here indulge me in some off kind of different Beatle topics here.
Oh, yeah. And again, I'll remind your viewers to check me out this coming Sunday when I review that book, because I'll really be able to stretch out in some wild conspiracy theories. If you want conspiracy theories, listen to me. I
That's
admit it.
right.
I am a conspiracy theorist.
Yes, you will find.
Conspiracy is like any with three people who get together and conspire. They breathe together. That's conspiracy, right? Con
Yeah.
breathing together. So yeah, I embrace the label and the tag.
And there's a lot to be understood about it because there's been to be called conspiracy theorist is also some people weaponize it,
Yeah.
so you have to really talk to the conspiracy and back it up with evidence, or debunk it with evidence. And those are the things that you do very well.
Mr. Williamson, it's been a pleasure.
Well, Darrell, I really appreciate you guesting on the show today, and we're going to get together again someday.
Thank you very much. Peace.